Metaethics, a Mystrikal Perspective. Part 1 of 12, Understanding Metaethics and Moral Foundations. Metaethics is the branch of philosophy that asks what morality is and how we know right from wrong. Instead of telling us which actions are good or bad, metaethics asks questions like, do words like good and evil refer to real, objective qualities? Can moral truths exist independently of our opinions or culture? How do we ground statements such as, kindness is good? For example, rather than debating whether lying is wrong, a metaethical inquiry asks what we mean by wrong, and whether this concept has any objective basis at all. This introduction sets the stage by clarifying key terms, including moral realism, objective morality, and moral rationalism. Moral realism is the view that statements such as, murder is wrong, report facts about the world, not just personal beliefs. Moral realists hold that some moral claims can be objectively true, much like scientific facts, and do not depend merely on what anyone happens to feel. In other words, cruelty would still be wrong even if everyone on Earth thought otherwise, because the wrongness lies in the action's harm, not in people's opinions. Moral realism doesn't specify what those facts are or how we know them. It simply insists they exist. This stands in contrast to anti-realist views that treat moral statements as mere expressions of emotion or as culturally relative. Closely related is objective morality, the idea that some moral principles hold universally, independent of individual opinions or cultural norms. If morality is objective, saying human trafficking is abhorrent means it really is abhorrent whether or not any particular society acknowledges it. Many moral realists use objective morality and moral facts almost interchangeably. However, one can be a realist, believing in moral facts, without claiming to know them instantly. Objective morality often emphasizes that certain ethical rules apply broadly. For example, stealing is wrong no matter who does it, as a moral universal. Traditional moral realism implies objective morality, since mind-independent moral truths would by definition apply to everyone. Mystrikism agrees with the basic idea that morality is not just whatever anyone feels, but when we later say objective, we mean methodologically objective, relative to clearly stated goals, using evidence and reason, not mind-independent cosmic rules. Moral rationalism is the view that reason and evidence are central to ethics, that we can figure out right and wrong through logical thinking, much like a scientist investigates nature. Classical rationalists, such as Kant, believed reason alone could discern fundamental moral principles. We emphasize that while emotions like empathy drive us to care about ethics, mystics believe our reason and scientific inquiry refine and guide these instincts. In short, we use our rational minds, supported by evidence, to test and justify moral claims rather than relying on tradition or pure feeling. Mystrikism's own stance ties these ideas together with a key twist. We hold that our moral goals, like reducing suffering or promoting well-being, are chosen by us, subjective. But once chosen, we use an objective, evidence-based process to meet them. In other words, we do not believe in ethereal, mind-independent moral facts floating in the universe. Instead, we first declare our moral aim. For instance, we should minimize unnecessary suffering. Then we look at reality, using science and reason to see which actions best achieve that aim. Under this view, our moral verdicts are evidence-constrained. Once a goal is chosen, facts about the world, natural consequences, tell us which actions genuinely align with it. For example, we might decide that compassion is good simply because studies show compassionate acts lead to healthier, happier communities. In summary, metaethics explores the nature of morality itself. Concepts like moral realism and objective morality suggest moral statements might refer to real facts, while moral rationalism highlights reason's role. Mystrikism agrees that there are genuine moral answers, but rejects any mystical source for them. Instead, we anchor morality in human-chosen goals, plus an objective, empirical method. The result is a subjectively grounded yet methodologically objective morality, as we'll see throughout the rest of this discussion. Philosophers using strict terminology would call this ethical naturalism or constructivism, not classic moral realism, because our values come from minds, and the objectivity lives in our method and in the facts about consequences. Meta-ethics, Part 2 of 12, Our Perspective, subjectively grounded, methodologically objective. Now that we understand the terms, we can describe Mystrikism's meta-ethical position. In brief, Mystriks see ourselves as subjectively grounded, methodologically objective ethical naturalists and moral rationalists. In plain language, we are not moral realists in the strict technical sense because we reject metaphysical, mind-independent moral facts. Instead, we treat our moral conclusions as emerging from a transparent process. We aim for conclusions that are openly goal-declared and then constrained by evidence and reasoning, for example, around reducing harm or promoting well-being. The core philosophy is rooted in philosophical naturalism and a commitment to honesty, reason, and justice. We view morality as a natural phenomenon best understood through science and evidence, not through religion or mysticism. Rational ethics naturalized. Mystrikism asserts that there are correct answers in ethics, but these answers are conditional rather than absolute. Once a community openly declares its moral aims, for example, let's reduce unnecessary suffering, or let's promote global well-being, the real world constrains which actions achieve those aims. In this sense, moral assessments become methodologically objective. Given our chosen aim, we can use empirical investigation to determine which actions succeed or fail in fulfilling it. We ground our ethical compass in observable, measurable features of life, the well-being of sapient beings, sentient life, and ecosystems, rather than in supernatural absolutes. For example, when a mystrik says compassion is good, we mean that compassionate behavior has observable positive effects on living creatures. We can ask questions like, does showing kindness tend to improve people's lives? Or, does cruelty tend to cause harm? If abundant evidence shows compassion consistently leads to stronger, healthier communities, and cruelty inflicts needless suffering, then compassion is good becomes an empirically supported conclusion relative to our goal of enhancing well-being. Similarly, we recognize that suffering is not bad in a cosmic sense, but it is bad because sentient beings experience it negatively. Once we agree, subjectively, that unnecessary suffering should be avoided, any action that reliably produces suffering violates that aim. That fact, that certain actions lead to suffering, gives us an objective ground to call them wrong, given our declared goal. This view avoids the need for any spooky, non-natural moral essences. For us, the facts of morality are simply facts about life, actions that increase health, reduce pain, promote flourishing, or support social harmony. Morality is not a hidden domain beyond the physical world. It flows from the same natural reality that science studies. In other words, just as we have objective facts about physical health, blood pressure, disease rates, etc., we can gather objective insights about a society's moral health once we define our values. We collect evidence about which social practices promote flourishing or cause harm, all measured against our chosen aims, divine commands, karma, or any appeal to the supernatural play no role in Mystrikism because they contradict our evidence-based approach. Ultimately, all right conduct must connect to its real-world consequences. We choose our fundamental values, like reducing suffering, through conscious decision. Once chosen, however, we let science and reasoning determine which actions best advance those values. In this way, objectivity resides in our method, not in any mind-independent cosmic moral law. Methodologically objective, not metaphysically absolute. Some critics worry that claiming an objective morality leads to a rigid, one true morality mindset. Mystrikism responds with nuance. We uphold core ethical principles, such as justice and harm reduction, as fundamentally sound. But we also recognize that different cultures may express these principles in different ways. Because we are grounded in subjectivity and methodologically objective, we temper our stance with cultural understanding, openness, and humility. In practice, this means we respect moral diversity and valuable cultural traditions, while also holding that some fundamental standards transcend cultural relativism. For example, justice and preventing harm are near universal as goals, yet each society may pursue them with its own customs. A mystrik might say, every culture deserves respect, and most cherish kindness and fairness, but if a practice egregiously harms well-being, like torture or slavery, it cannot be justified just because it's a tradition. Even if that practice is culturally ingrained, it thwarts any honest vision of universal flourishing. Rather than dismissing other moral codes outright, we seek dialogue. If a principle empirically promotes well-being and reduces suffering, we consider it universally good, or at least relevant everywhere. By applying reason and evidence to shared aims, we identify moral strategies that work across contexts. We reject both anything-goes relativism and blind absolutism. For us, objectivity comes from using reliable, reproducible methods to test ethical hypotheses in the real world after clarifying our values, rather than from any supposed infallible commandment. In this way, Mystrikism avoids the rigidity of dogma and the aimlessness of pure personal preference. We maintain conviction in our core values: compassion, fairness, honesty, but with the humility to continue listening, learning, and updating our understanding as needed. Rationalism with heart. When we say Mystrikism is morally rationalist, we mean that reason, critical thinking, and evidence are central to deciding what to do. We answer the question, how do we find the right answers in ethics? By examining evidence and logic, not by emotion alone or unexamined tradition. That said, we also acknowledge the vital role of emotion. Empathy, compassion, and love motivate us to care about morality in the first place. Mystrikism emphasizes that reason works together with our humane instincts. Our passions show that we care. Reason tells us how to act on that care effectively. For example, our emotional response to injustice, anger or compassion, is important, but we also analyze the facts behind it. Moral debates are not just cheering and booing. We discuss the real consequences of policies and actions. Emotions often latch onto genuine problems. We feel anger because someone is harmed unfairly. In Mystrikism, we say that moral statements are claims that can be examined and tested, much like scientific hypotheses. We argue with evidence. If I claim this policy is unjust, I'm saying it fails our harm reduction goal, and I'm prepared to show data supporting that. Thus, even as our hearts lead us to care about morality, our minds guide us in fulfilling that care. In sum, Mystrikism's meta-ethical stance is only realism-flavored at the level of outcomes, in a modest, conditional sense. Once we choose our aims, some moral claims can only be objectively right or wrong relative to those aims. Technically, this is still ethical naturalism or constructivism, because our values come from minds and the objectivity lives in our method and in the facts about consequences, not in mind-independent moral properties. Put bluntly, we pick the moral goal, and then reality tells us what works or fails. There is nothing spooky or magical about our morality. Philosophers who use moral realism in the strict way would usually classify this as ethical naturalism or constructivism, not full-blown moral realism. We will now see how mystriks engage with classic challenges to any moral theory. Meta-ethics, Part 3 of 12, Engaging with Key Critiques. Any robust theory must confront the classic objections philosophers have raised. Mystrikism is no exception. We actively grapple with challenges to our methodologically objective, naturalistic, rational stance. Here are two major critiques and Mystrikism's responses. The is-ought gap, Hume's problem. David Hume pointed out that you can't derive an ought, a prescriptive claim, solely from an is, a descriptive fact, unless you include a value premise. In other words, describing how the world is doesn't automatically tell us how we should act. We first need to decide what we care about. Mystrikism acknowledges this gap openly. We start with an explicit value: well-being matters and suffering is bad. This value is nearly universal. Virtually all beings prefer less suffering. Once we accept reducing suffering is our goal, factual claims about what causes harm or benefit become directly relevant to what we ought to do. For instance, if scientific data shows that universal health care dramatically improves well-being, then given our declared goal of reducing suffering, we have clear grounds to say, we ought to support that health care policy. In short, we bridge Hume's gap by declaring our foundational value, such as suffering is bad, up front. We do not smuggle the ought secretly, we wear it openly. Starting from well-being matters, reality can then tell us which actions help that aim. Some philosophers might still debate whether this fully solves Hume's puzzle, but from the Mystrikal point of view, it provides an honest, practical solution. Once you choose your aims, you can empirically figure out how to reach them. Moral oughts become answerable questions of cause and effect, not mystical leaps of faith. Evolutionary debunking. A common worry is that if our moral intuitions evolved, for example, to favor kin or repel outsiders, then they may be just survival tools, not true moral insight. If evolution only shaped good feelings for reproductive advantage, can we trust them as evidence of real morality? Mystrikism says, yes, many of our instincts come from evolution and culture, but that doesn't make all morality arbitrary. In fact, evolution often equipped us with instincts that do enhance well-being: empathy, fairness, cooperation. Probably because those behaviors helped our ancestors thrive. Those evolved traits often align with what truly promotes flourishing. However, we do not treat evolution's outcomes as the final word on morality. Instead, we use those instincts as useful starting points and then test them against our declared aims. For example, evolution gave humans a tendency toward tribalism or jealousy, but we recognize that in the modern world, unchecked tribalism often causes unnecessary conflict. Mystriks ask, does following this evolved impulse promote well-being today? If the answer is yes, like kindness usually does, we can embrace it. If not, like irrational fear of others, we resist or reform it. We are not slaves to our genes. We acknowledge evolution's influence, but then apply reason and compassion to decide which impulses truly serve our moral goals. In doing so, Mystrikism turns evolutionary insights into evidence about what helps or hinders well-being, rather than into unassailable moral commands. Evolution provides data points, such as kindness correlates with group survival, but we interpret those within our rational framework. This diffuses the charge that our theory is just an adaptive illusion. Instead, it's a naturalistic ethics that learns from evolution, but is tested by evidence and values. By directly addressing these critiques, Mystrikism shows that declaring our values and using empirical inquiry is both honest and practical. We don't claim to solve every deep philosophical puzzle once and for all, but we provide a working framework. We start with well-being matters, and then let the evidence guide our moral judgments. Metaethics, Part 4 of 12, Moral Disagreement and Relativism. People across cultures and eras often disagree profoundly over moral issues. One society's virtue can be another's vice. At first glance, this may seem to undercut the idea of any objective morality. If even wise people can't agree on what's right, is there any truth to morality? Mystrikism tackles this with nuance. We fully acknowledge the complexity of moral diversity. Mystriks understand that not all cultures secretly agree. Fundamental differences exist in practices and beliefs. appreciating cultural context is important to us. However, we do not conclude that anything goes. Instead, we look for common ground and then evaluate conflicting norms using methodologically objective criteria, namely, the observable effects on well-being relative to our stated goals. From the Mystrikal perspective, many moral disagreements are surface rather than core. For example, one culture might show respect for elders by bowing, while another might show respect through a particular greeting or way of speaking. These customs differ, but beneath them lies a shared universal value, respect for elders. Mystrikism would say, behind different customs is often a common ethical goal, in this case showing care and respect, one that generally supports human flourishing, no matter how it's expressed. We hold that values like kindness, fairness, and reducing harm are sensible and rational aims because they align with human nature, even if societies fulfill them in unique ways. When a cultural practice appears to conflict with well-being, for example, a ritual that causes serious injury, mystriks respond with respectful yet truth-seeking dialogue. We gather data and ask, does this practice measurably harm people? Suppose the answer is yes. For instance, evidence shows a rite causes trauma. In that case, although we honor the culture's identity, we also recognize an objective concern. The practice is undermining well-being. We would work with the community to find alternatives that preserve positive cultural values without causing harm. In all cases, we stand firm on our fundamental aim of reducing unnecessary suffering. In practice, a mystrik will handle moral disagreement by asking questions like, how does each side's custom affect the well-being of those involved? Can we measure or at least objectively assess the outcomes? By aligning with the declared aim of well-being, we strive to move debates from mere opinion to evidence-based conclusions. If one culture's practices lead to illness or trauma, while another culture avoids them and has healthier, happier people, those facts suggest an objective moral difference, regardless of cultural justification. That said, mystriks practice epistemic humility. We know some moral conflicts are tough, and we may not have immediate answers. Disagreement isn't seen as proof that nobody is right, but rather as an opportunity to learn. We keep dialogue open, gather more information, and try to understand each perspective fully. Often, a deeper investigation reveals common values or overlooked aspects of harm. Even if conflict persists, Mystrikism holds that relative to our declared aims, there is a fact of the matter about what promotes well-being, even if it's complex or not yet fully known. We reject extreme relativism not by proclaiming absolute moral laws, but by insisting that, given shared goals, we can reliably assess actions through evidence and reason. We often summarize our view as unity in core values, diversity in expression. Mystrikism rejects the idea that morality is a mere social construct, or that every opinion is equally valid. Specific harms, like torture for pleasure, are clearly wrong in all human societies when judged by their effect on well-being. At the same time, we reject one-size-fits-all moral imperialism. Mystriks strive to understand cultural nuances and work with communities, not simply impose our views without dialogue. The fundamental principle remains: reduce suffering and promote flourishing wherever possible. In complex disagreements, we proceed with conviction in our core goals and humility about our knowledge. We trust that, in the long run, evidence and compassionate reasoning can guide us closer to shared moral truths. This is how Mystrikism navigates the waters of moral pluralism. Meta-ethics, Part 5 of 12, Moral Knowledge Through Science and Reflection. Suppose one day we all agreed on the right moral goals, like minimizing harm. How would we know which actions truly achieve them? We don't have a moral microscope to directly observe moral truth as we do with bacteria under a real microscope. Our judgments are often clouded by bias, emotion, and limited perspective. Mystrikism addresses this by analogy with science. We can investigate the effects of actions to gain moral knowledge, even if moral properties themselves aren't directly visible. In Mystrikism, we define the good in terms of well-being, a factual, observable outcome. Then, we use empirical methods to see how our choices affect that well-being. Think of it like a medical hypothesis. We test treatments to see which improve health. Similarly, for a moral hypothesis like policy X is good, we ask, what are the results of policy X? Does it lead to better health, happiness, and social cooperation, or more suffering and conflict? We gather data, observe outcomes, and reason about cause and effect. Over time, careful observation and measurement have enabled us to answer many moral questions with confidence. These answers are always conditional on our aims, so they are provisional and open to new evidence, but they can become methodically objective as they rest on reproducible empirical criteria. For example, consider environmental ethics. Mystriks would collect data on pollution, species extinction rates, and climate impacts. If a certain action, like clear-cutting a rainforest, leads to dirtier air and water, the loss of wildlife, and harm to human communities, those facts strongly suggest, under our aim of protecting life, that clear-cutting is wrong. Conversely, if sustainable forestry or reforestation leads to cleaner air, richer biodiversity, and healthier communities, those positive outcomes count as evidence that such practices are right. We see that well-being indicators, things like health statistics, happiness surveys, crime rates, education levels, and environmental quality, can serve as empirical anchors. By comparing these indicators under different choices, we get a data-driven way to judge moral rightness. Of course, we're aware that measuring well-being is complex. No single metric captures the full scope of morality. That's why Mystriks use multiple lines of evidence. We might examine health data, psychological assessments, economic figures, ecological measures, and more. If all independent metrics point the same way, say, option A consistently results in more suffering and option B in more flourishing, then we have a strong, evidence-based case that B is morally better. Throughout this process, Mystriks remain humble and fallibilist. We know our moral knowledge might be incomplete or flawed, but this is a strength, not a weakness. Science gets better by questioning itself and incorporating new findings, and ethics should do the same. Just as medicine refines its conclusions when new trials appear, we will update our moral conclusions as new evidence emerges. Mystrikal moral beliefs are never dogmas, but provisional conclusions that improve with time. A famous philosophical challenge here is G.E. Moore's open question argument. Moore noted that for any naturalistic definition of good, one can always sensibly ask, is that really good? For example, even if I say good means causing pleasure, someone can always ask, but is pleasure really good? This suggests good might resist a complete natural definition. Mystrikism responds pragmatically. We explain that when we say something promotes well-being, we mean it fulfills the needs and desires of living beings. If someone insists, but is well-being truly good, we point out that this is just a hollow rephrasing of our definition. It's like asking, is being healthy good? Of course it is. By definition, health improves life. We might invite skeptics to imagine a life of misery versus a life of happiness. It seems obvious which is better. Mystriks argue that this very fact, living beings preferring well-being to suffering, is enough to settle the matter for practical purposes. We do acknowledge that, philosophically, one could keep asking, yes, but is it really good? Forever. Practically speaking, however, once we agree that morality aims to make lives better, a goal almost everyone shares at some level, endlessly doubting that goal is a fruitless exercise. In short, we say we define good as what makes life go well for beings. Given that, further questioning doesn't change how we live or decide. In Mystrikism, Building moral knowledge mirrors, building scientific knowledge. We draw on evidence from fields such as psychology, sociology, and ecology to understand the consequences of actions on living systems. Just as experiments show us how medicines work, statistical studies reveal what social policies improve well-being. For instance, research might show that policies promoting education and economic opportunity lead to measurable drops in crime and improvements in health. These findings directly inform our moral conclusions. They tell us that such policies are good because they serve our declared goal of human flourishing. Finally, Mystrikism encourages us to see history's moral changes as progress, driven by increasing understanding. Abolition of slavery, women's rights, and environmental awareness. These shifts are not mere fashions or divine miracles to us. We view them as humanity gradually converging on better, evidence-based moral behaviors. When societies recognized that slavery harmed all humans, or that women's empowerment benefits entire communities, they updated their moral beliefs. Mystriks celebrate these developments as leaps toward the good, not just social changes. We see them as evidence that reason, empathy, and science are finding better, evidence-based answers to ethical aims over time. In this way, moral knowledge grows with our understanding of the world, guided by curiosity, dialogue, and a willingness to revise our views. Metaethics, Part 6 of 12. Contrasting Mystrikism with other metaethical theories. To better see what Mystrikism offers, it helps to compare it with other well-known theories. Emotivism. This view holds that moral statements don't report facts, but merely express our emotions or attitudes, like saying yay for charity or boo to theft. While emotivism captures how passionately we often speak about ethics, Mystrikism disagrees with reducing morality to mere feelings. We argue that when people say stealing is wrong, they usually intend a truth claim. Stealing really harms trust and well-being. Our moral discourse is more than cheers and jeers. We can debate whether stealing causes harm or erodes social bonds, and that debate relies on evidence and reason, not just emotion. If pure emotivism were true, such discussions would be pointless. Instead, we see moral debates as meaningful and often progressive. Evidence and arguments do change minds. Thus, Mystrikism rejects emotivism's oversimplification and affirms that moral language, even when emotional, points to real concerns about the world. Moral relativism, the idea that right and wrong are entirely relative to culture or individual choice. Mystriks believe there are objective ways, relative to declared goals, to evaluate actions. While we respect that customs vary, we maintain that some actions objectively harm well-being, no matter who does them. For example, systemic cruelty or exploitation is wrong, regardless of cultural acceptance, because it fails the test of harm reduction. We reject anything goes relativism. At the same time, we don't endorse blind moral imperialism. Mystriks seek common ground and fair discussion, not saying, our way is right because we said so. We say, once goals like reducing suffering are declared, evidence shows some actions hurt those goals. That conclusion isn't relative in a trivial way, it's empirically grounded. In this sense, Mystrikism is a pluralistic, goal-relative objectivism, universal in its core aims, but flexible in how they are pursued. Here, objectivism just means that once we clearly state goals like reducing suffering, some answers are really better than others by the evidence. This is objectivism in a practical, method-based sense, not a claim that there are mind-independent moral facts built into the universe. Constructivism. Some theories claim moral truths are constructed by procedures, like democratic votes or rational agreement. Mystrikism holds that values are transparent. We construct our values by choosing them. But we insist that once values are determined, reality constrains the right answers. We don't simply set moral rules by fiat. We test them against consequences. Error theory. The claim that all moral statements are false because there are no moral facts. Mystrikism flatly rejects this nihilism, considering it self-defeating. If no moral claim can be true, then even guiding principles like valuing compassion or truth would be meaningless, an unworkable stance. We hold that once aims are stated, empirical facts about the world allow us to judge actions meaningfully. Saying murder is wrong is not an illusion or mere error. It's a true statement about harm given our value of protecting life. In each case, Mystrikism carves out a middle path. Morality is not a subjective whim, nor an ineffable divine decree, nor an emotion alone. It is a method-based, evidence-guided navigation that people everywhere can participate in, grounded in our shared reality of sentient life. Meta-ethics, Part 7 of 12, Mystrikal Ethics in the Real World. Having established our commitment to methodologically objective, naturalistic, and rational ethics, we now turn to practice. How do these principles guide real-world ethics in public policy, social justice, environmental issues, and personal conduct? In Mystrikism, moral conclusions are rational judgments based on evidence, evaluated against declared aims like harm reduction or flourishing. We are not saying there are free-floating moral facts built into the universe. We are saying that once we pick our goals, reality tells us which actions really help or really harm. In practice, that means we approach ethical dilemmas by asking, what actions will measurably reduce harm and promote well-being for those involved? This question guides us whether the context is criminal justice reform, climate policy, healthcare, or anything else. Procedurally objective morality in everyday dilemmas. Environment and nature. Mystriks protect ecosystems not because nature has magical rights, but because healthy ecosystems clearly support life. Once we declare the goal of promoting well-being for all life, science shows that preserving biodiversity, clean air, and water reliably furthers that goal. For example, we can measure improvements in air quality and wildlife populations under different practices. These outcomes serve as evidence that the practice is morally beneficial. We also extend moral concern to animals and ecosystems as part of all life. Actions like excessive cruelty to animals or habitat destruction are objectively wrong by mystrikal standards because the evidence shows they undermine the declared aim of living in harmony. Yet we balance this with empathy and context. For instance, many mystriks choose plant-based diets to reduce animal suffering, but we understand the cultural and practical challenges involved. Our core aim, harm reduction, is met through kindness and sustainability, even as we respect local realities and seek gentle change rather than imposition. Social justice and policy. Mystriks insist on evidence-based measures of well-being as the yardstick for good laws and policies. A policy is justifiable if data show it reliably improves lives and reduces suffering, in line with our moral aims. This standard is procedurally objective, grounded in tangible outcomes. For instance, consider an urban development plan. A mystrik would examine whether it provides accessible housing, green spaces, and community resources that measurably boost health and reduce stress. If studies indicate such benefits, and perhaps greater social equity and opportunity, we consider the project morally sound. Throughout this, we act with honesty and integrity. Transparency, fairness, and humility are emphasized in planning and debate. Similarly, in healthcare ethics, we rely on outcomes. If evidence shows that universal healthcare reduces illness and suffering, then, given our goal of harming no one, we conclude society should provide it. The moral imperative to care for others emerges not as a mystical truth, but as a practical, evidence-based conclusion. We should ensure healthcare access because doing so clearly advances our shared aim of reducing suffering. This illustrates how mystriks bridge the Azot gap. Once values are set, facts become decisive. Complex cultural issues. Not all questions yield easy data. Here, too, Mystrikism applies its method. Take a fraud example like female genital mutilation, FGM. Faced with this practice, a Mystrik calmly examines the evidence. FGM causes severe health and psychological harm. No cultural or religious norm can justify that suffering relative to our aim of well-being. Yet we approach the issue respectfully. We would engage with the community, present the facts compassionately, and support alternatives that preserve cultural identity without causing harm, such as non-invasive coming-of-age ceremonies. In short, we live our values: honest, reasoned, compassionate engagement. Throughout all areas: environmental policy, animal welfare, public health, social justice, Mystriks apply the core tenets of justice, honesty, and harm minimization, always checking our judgments against reality. We see justice as a compass pointing to empirical good, and science as a map charting the way there. In sum, Mystrikal ethics in practice are not guided by metaphysical decrees, but by methodologically objective conclusions drawn from real-world evidence and our openly stated moral aims. Meta-ethics, Part 8 of 12, Lines in the Sand, Honesty and Justice over Cultural Norms. Mystrikism holds that no cultural or ideological norm can justify violating truth or inflicting harm, once we evaluate things through an evidence-based, objective lens. We do not rely on mind-independent moral truths. Instead, we use transparent moral aims, like reducing suffering and promoting well-being, and empirical facts. Honesty and justice are procedural pillars for us. Honesty means committing to the best current approximation of objective truth, BCA of objective truth, and justice means promoting long-term fairness and flourishing. In practice, this means Mystriks openly challenge any practices, leaders, or ideologies that persistently cause harm or spread misinformation, especially when those responsible have had opportunities to change. Importantly, we emphasize that critiquing damaging ideas is not the same as condemning entire cultures or peoples. One can oppose a harmful tradition while still treating its adherents with respect. Below are illustrative examples where Mystrikism's commitment to truth and justice overrides subjective customs, showing how an evidence-based ethic confronts cultural relativism. Education, teaching truth over dogma. Science and factual knowledge are prime examples where honesty outranks tradition. Mystriks insist that the best current scientific understanding, the BCA of objective truth, must be taught even if it conflicts with religious or cultural dogma. For instance, consider the Taliban's ban on girls' education. This policy glorifies ideology over proven benefits of schooling. We find such a stance ethically unacceptable. The objective benefits of education, from better health and economic outcomes to personal empowerment, are well documented. No appeal to tradition can justify depriving young women of these. Mystrikism would firmly oppose such policies, not because we believe in immutable moral laws, but because evidence shows denying education inflicts grave harm relative to our aim of flourishing. Similarly, debates over teaching evolution versus creationism in schools illustrate this tension. In some communities, religious narratives are pressed into science classes. Mystriks are clear. Science classes must teach science. Evolution by natural selection is supported by overwhelming evidence and is part of our current best understanding of biology. Teaching creationism, as science fails the honesty test, it is not supported by reliable, falsifiable evidence, and ultimately harms students by misinforming them. We advocate for curricula grounded in objective inquiry, evolution, cosmology, evidence-based history, even if they upset religious sensitivities. In short, factual truth in education takes precedence over any cultural or religious tradition. Deception and misinformation, truth over tribal allegiance. Mystrikism demands allegiance to reality above all. In many places, people feel social pressure to accept false political or ideological narratives. Mystriks refuse to bow to such pressure. We see truth-telling as a non-negotiable moral duty. Consider the rise of anti-vaccine misinformation in recent years. Rejecting vaccines became a kind of cultural identity for some, driven by conspiracy theories. Mystrikism regards this as a moral failure. It puts group identity above clear evidence. The science is unequivocal that vaccines save lives. The spread of vaccine lies during the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, led to unnecessary deaths. No political or cultural belief can justify that harm. A mystrik would actively call out and correct such falsehoods, even if it causes discomfort. In essence, our loyalty is to facts and well-being, not to ideology or tribal identity. In all these cases, mystriks draw a line at harmful ignorance or oppression. We see honesty and justice as inseparable. A community cannot flourish under either. This commitment flows directly from our meta-ethical principles, the belief that reality, through evidence, is our ally in moral questions. If something is true, it remains true regardless of popular denial. If something truly harms people, it is damaging, regardless of tradition. Mystrikism empowers us to respect cultures while still courageously speaking truth and defending justice, trusting that this integrity will ultimately serve the well-being of all. Meta-ethics, Part 9 of 12, Lines in the Sand, Cruelty and Harm over Oppressive Traditions. At the heart of mystrikal justice is promoting well-being and preventing harm. We evaluate customs not by their antiquity, but by their impact on living beings. Any tradition or system that inflicts cruelty, suffering, or gross inequality cannot be justified when measured against our moral aims. That means no custom is above scrutiny. If a practice consistently causes needless suffering, our commitment to harm reduction demands we oppose it, even if it has deep cultural roots. For example, consider systemic discrimination such as racism or gender oppression. These injustices may be embedded in law or social norms, making them seem normal to those who live within those systems. Mystrikism calls a spade a spade. Regardless of tradition, these are moral failures. Suppose data show that a practice, say segregated policing or denying women education, leads to clear, measurable harm for a group of people. In that case, tradition is not an excuse to continue it. Mystriks see these as methodologically identifiable failures of justice relative to our declared aims. The only moral course is reform or abolition. History supports this. Slavery and denying women's rights were once defended by tradition, yet evidence and empathy eventually exposed them as profoundly harmful. In mystrikal terms, such practices are wrong, not because of any metaphysical decree, but because once our moral aim is declared, human flourishing, the evidence was clear that these practices undermined it. Standing against them is recognized as moral progress. We therefore stand with those challenging, cruel norms, activists fighting racism, advocates for women's equality, whistleblowers exposing abuse. Even if it means going against one's community, justice demands it, even when it conflicts with upbringing or majority opinion. To illustrate, Mystrikism often highlights particularly harmful traditions. Female genital mutilation, FGM. This is a ritual in some communities, justified by custom or notions of purity. Mystriks confront FGM by looking at the facts. It causes profound and lasting physical and psychological harm to girls and women. From our standpoint, no cultural norm can justify that suffering. The ethical response is twofold: firmly oppose the practice as unjust and simultaneously engage compassionately with the community to find alternatives that honor their culture without causing harm, for instance, by supporting safe substitute rites of passage. This compassionate but unflinching approach exemplifies mystrikal justice. We condemn the act objectively, due to evidence of harm, while working empathetically to change hearts and minds. Other oppressive practices. The same logic applies to things like child marriage, honor violence, extreme punitive punishments, or any system that systematically creates trauma or injustice. In each case, Mystrikism's metric is always the real-world impact on well-being. If a practice causes fear, pain, or stunted potential, it is wrong by our criteria, regardless of how deeply tradition may hide behind it. That said, we reject smug moral imperialism. We recognize the importance of dialogue and understanding. The goal is not to wholesalely dismiss a culture, but to identify specific harms and address them effectively. For example, in opposing systemic racism, a Mystrik will cite data showing how bias in policing or housing leads to poorer health and poverty for certain groups. This makes clear that such inequality is empirically bad for flourishing, not just wrong according to us. In combating gender oppression, we point to studies showing that empowering women improves outcomes for entire societies: health, education, economic growth. These facts demonstrate that equity is objectively reasonable. When persuasion and understanding fail and grave injustice persists, Mystrikism holds that our principle of justice may require more decisive action. This could include supporting those who break unjust laws or aiding victims to escape oppressive conditions. The Union of Mystriks explicitly champions decency and opposes injustice, and adapts its response to the severity of the harm. In extreme cases, this might mean aligning against tyrannical regimes or extremist groups, for instance, opposing Nazism or apartheid, which were culturally entrenched but undeniably evil by the evidence. Ultimately, Mystrikal ethics uses a simple moral compass. Practices that significantly hinder well-being are wrong, full stop, regardless of how ancient or widespread they are. Being honest and just means seeing suffering for what it is and acting to stop it, guided by evidence and empathy instead of blind loyalty or fear. Meta-ethics, Part 10 of 12, Moral Knowledge Through Science and Reflection, continued. Building on our earlier discussion of moral knowledge, in Part 5, we emphasize that, in Mystrikism, morality is discovered and refined much as science is. We treat moral inquiries with the same rigor and openness as we do scientific ones. Moral claims are not taken on authority. They are tested against reality research from psychology, sociology, biology, and other fields becomes part of our ethical toolkit. For example, studies show that acts of kindness and compassion improve mental health for everyone involved. Such findings reinforce our moral confidence in valuing kindness. It is good not because of any mystical rule, but because evidence demonstrates its benefits. Values like honesty and fairness are similarly grounded in their practical outcomes. Honest societies tend to build trust and stability. Fair laws tend to lower conflict and improve social welfare. These are moral conclusions derived from natural phenomena, not divine edicts. We treat them as tools for moral navigation, procedures that reliably guide us to better outcomes in a world inhabited by valuing minds. In Mystrikism, moral progress itself is treated as an ongoing experiment. We formulate moral hypotheses, proposals for how to act, and test them. If a policy or action leads to clear improvements in well-being, we count that as knowledge gained. If an intended moral rule fails or has harmful side effects, we revise or discard it. This keeps our system self-correcting. We emphasize continual re-examination and intellectual growth. Nothing is above question, not even cherished principles. If new evidence or arguments arise, we update our understanding. This dynamic process is very different from systems with immutable commandments. Meta-ethics, Part 11 of 12, Mystrikism versus Tradition. Mystrikism's naturalistic, evidence-based morality stands in sharp contrast to traditional religious or cultural systems. Moral authority in traditional religions often comes from divine commands or ancient texts. These claim universality but lack empirical grounding. Mystrikism does not accept unverifiable revelations as ethical foundations. Instead, we draw authority from observable reality and reason. For instance, where a religion might say X is right because God said so, mystrics would say X is right because evidence shows it improves lives. See for yourself. In our view, anybody, regardless of background, can arrive at mystric conclusions by examining reality with compassion and logic. We don't require faith or esoteric insight, only the willingness to look at how actions affect well-being. Another key difference is flexibility. Traditional moral codes are often static, tied to ancient texts that may clash with modern life, such as pre-scientific views on gender or environmental stewardship. Mystrikism is explicitly adaptive. Our principles are based on outcomes and evidence, so we must evolve them as new knowledge emerges. This is seen not as weakness, but as intellectual honesty. For example, if climate change becomes a dire issue, which old scriptures never mentioned, our morals must respond. Clinging to outdated rules in light of contrary evidence would be a failure of integrity. Mystrics argue that reality provides a truer compass than rigid ancient laws. Far from sliding into relativism, Mystrikism maintains firm core values, compassion, fairness, honesty, that almost any rational person can agree on, while allowing our methods of achieving them to update. This avoids moral stagnation, the problem of insisting that an ancient law must never change, and avoids moral exclusivity. Many religions imply that only insiders have moral truth. Mystrikism rejects that our criteria for moral action come from reality itself, observable effects on well-being, so no one group has a monopoly on morality. Practically, this means Mystrikism is open to learning ethical insights from anywhere, so long as they withstand rational scrutiny, and welcomes others to learn from us. The authority of ethics in Mystrikism comes from reason and reality, not from edicts. Values like honesty and compassion earn their standing by the tangible benefits they bring to life. In short, where traditional systems say, X is right because our ancestors or gods decreed it, Mystrikism says, X is right because it improves lives. Trust that evidence, not unquestioned faith. This is a profound shift. Ethics legitimacy comes from the ground up, not top down, emphasizing trust over faith. Trust is earned by consistency and evidence. It isn't demanded by authority. Meta-ethics, Part 12 of 12, Embodying Mystrikal Ethics. How do mystrics live these ideas every day? The abstract principles above are meant to be practiced in our daily lives, in our choices, and in our advocacy. On a personal level, a mystric strives to be mindful and intentional, constantly aligning actions with core values of kindness and honesty. A simple but powerful habit is pausing and reflecting before acting, a moment of moral deliberation. In that pause, a mystric might ask, how can I respond in a way that reduces harm and improves well-being for everyone involved? This encapsulates mystrikal ethics in action, using evidence-informed reasoning to guide even small everyday decisions. For instance, if someone snaps at us in anger, a mystric might recall the value of patience and the fact that staying calm tends to diffuse conflict. So instead of an angry retort, we choose a gentler reply. Or when shopping, we might consider a product's impact. Was it made ethically? Is it eco-friendly? We weigh such questions using our moral aims over time. This discipline becomes a habit, a mode of existence where actions result from deliberate choice rather than unexamined habit. We cultivate this through practices akin to secular spiritual exercises, mindfulness meditation, mindful breathing, and reaffirming our values. These tools help us transcend knee-jerk impulses and act according to empathy and reason. In doing so, every mystric becomes a kind of moral scientist. We treat daily choices as experiments. We hypothesize what is kind, test it through action, observe the results, and adjust. This cultivates a continuous learning mode. Even small acts of goodness can have a ripple effect in the interconnected web of life. Mystrikism teaches that by consistently choosing what we think is right and checking against outcomes, we gradually refine our moral understanding. Beyond the individual, mystrikal ethics extend naturally to community and activism. Identifying as a Mystrik often means committing to improving the world concretely, guided by the twin lights of science and justice. Many Mystriks engage in environmental, social, and humanitarian causes because we believe that morality can, and should, address real-world problems. If we truly accept that the well-being of all life is our ultimate aim, then we're compelled to act wherever we see suffering or injustice. For example, a Mystrik might volunteer with community projects, education programs, health clinics, conservation efforts, or advocate for policies like renewable energy or fair economic practices. In these efforts, we lean on evidence and respectful dialogue rather than rhetoric or partisanship. We vote, campaign, and speak out from our moral framework. Honesty and justice matter. Even in public discourse, Mystriks fact-check, admit uncertainty when needed, and stay civil. It's about rational altruism, using the best available knowledge to fuel our good intentions. In everyday life, this also translates into many small choices. A Mystrik might consciously reduce their carbon footprint because they care about future generations' well-being, donate to effective charities that demonstrably help people, or volunteer to help others in need. We understand these actions as meaningful contributions to the greater flourishing. Mystrikism reminds us that no act is too minor. Each is part of an ongoing experiment in making lives better. By treating kindness, honesty, and scientific thinking as the cornerstones of life, Mystriks strive to embody a distinctively human capability, the ability to use empathy and reason together to build a better world. In summary, Mystrikal ethics is all about practice. It's not enough to believe in evidence-based morality, we must live it. We develop conscious habits of compassion and reflection, apply empirical reasoning in our choices, and commit to continuous moral learning. By doing so, we hope not only to improve our own conduct, but to inspire others. After all, Mystriks see themselves as part of a community striving for the shared goal of reducing suffering and promoting flourishing. This is morality in action, a collaborative, ever-improving pursuit of well-being for all.